Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Trouble and Strife, an adventure audio drama series set in the fantasy world of Runescape, written and narrated by Josh Hayes. Episode 2, X marks the spot. I placed another worn gold coin on the bar and the barman poured another pint. He tipped the froth from the glass and placed it down in front of me. I took a long, deep drink as he unstuck the coin from the bar and flicked it into the till, then paced away to serve someone else. The bar was quiet. The Sheared Ram, a small building in Lumbridge next to the riverbank and a short walk from the castle. Everything was wooden, old creaking beams supporting the thin roof, a wooden bar built at a slight angle so my drink wasn't sitting just level, making all the bubbles glide up to one edge of the glass. The bar stool I was sitting on was slightly shorter than the one next to it, the cheap red fabric that stretched over the top, tearing and pulling at the rivets trying to hold it down. It wasn't a great pub, but after being kicked by a cow, covered in egg and violently assaulting a goblin, I was happy to have a place to sit and drink in peace. Over in the corner, a young man with expertly brushed hair stood hunched over a round table, an old paper map unfolded on it. He was studying each detail, placing the metal tip of a compass on it, twiddling the compass legs, and then marking each point with a pencil, all the time muttering to himself, "I'm gonna be rich, I'm gonna be rich, I'm gonna be rich!" I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intrigued. A treasure map adventure would be more to my liking than the previous cake-based farce, so while sipping slowly from my drink, I twisted very slightly in my chair and watched the man closely. While I stared, he pulled more instruments from a black satchel under the table and started using them on the map. A sailor's sextant, an old stopwatch. He had a spade leaning against the table edge, all the while stepping around the table and marking the map. Long lines, small dots, intersecting points. Eventually, the map was more marking than map, and while I was distracted by his focused scribbling, I heard a gruff voice behind me. "It's fake, you know." I turned and saw a gentleman had sat down on the stool beside me. The old, robed man was taller than me, and the stool he sat on taller than mine, causing him to tower a good foot above me. I had to strain my neck to meet his gaze. A long grey beard, groomed but with several stray curly hairs poking out, bushy grey eyebrows and cold grey eyes. He seemed to emanate a cold aura, which chilled my glass as I held it. The man continued, "The map he's reading, it's a fake." I spun my head to look at the young man marking the map in the corner. He was still pacing round the table, still checking and double-checking. This older gentleman had obviously seen me staring. I turned back to him. "How would you know that?" I asked. The old man's lips twisted into a smile as he reached his wrinkled hand into a pocket of his robe. "Because the real ones." He took out a small piece of rolled-up parchment and placed it on the bar next to my drink. "Are much smaller." I looked at the folded parchment and back to the man. He nodded his head toward it, as if inviting me to unfold it. I did, and saw the small square of fabric was a long riddle. The old man spoke again. "This is what they look like, smaller, more focused." I read the riddle on the fabric. Within the town of Lumbridge lives a man named Bob. He walks out his door and takes 1 step east, 7 steps north, 5 west, 1 south, and finally digs. There he buries his treasure. I frowned and turned to the old man. "Why are you showing me this?" The old man leaned forward slightly. "Because I need your help." With that, he leaned back, shuffled on his seat slightly, and held out an aging hand for me to shake. I did. His skin was dry and bony. "I am Vios, a stranger to these lands, and right now I am in need of a favor." Despite having never met this man, something about his voice was calming, comforting. It contained no hint of malice, although a strange sense of mystery. So I responded, "Pleasure to meet you. I'm Strife. Not sure how much help I'll be, probably as much a stranger as you are." Vios glanced over to the young man, marking the larger map, then back at me. "That young man has been sold a fake map, but this..." Vios poked a bony finger onto the folded parchment on the bar. "This is the real deal. One of the lost clue scrolls." With his finger still on the fabric, he slid it along the bar closer to me. "And I want you to solve it." I stared down at the clue, then back at Vios. "Why me?" Vios slowly rose from the stool, and shook his cloak as he stretched his legs and arms. "Because you look like a man who can, and if you do, I'll owe you a favour, and you want me owing you a favour." The young man in the corner was chanting louder now about money and gold and was tidying away his equipment, seemingly happy with whatever plans he'd made. Vios started walking toward the door of the pub and then shouted back over to me, "Solve the clue, then meet me on the Port Sarim docks." With that, he opened the door and walked out into the afternoon sun. What an odd encounter. I turned back to the clue scroll and unfolded it, reading it again. Was it the real deal? Maybe it was a prank, or the ramblings of some senile old man who liked to waste people's time. I thought about just leaving it on the side, or throwing it away, but I couldn't deny I was intrigued. The young man in the corner had finished packing away his tools and slung his pack over his back, picking up his spade, and with a final cry of, "I'm gonna be rich!" he threw open the door and ran into the street. He was off on an adventure, blindly trusting a map. So maybe I should do the same. I had nothing better to do. As the bartender paced up and down, cleaning glasses and putting them away, I raised my hand and caught his eye. "Anyone called Bob live locally?" The bartender thought for a moment before replying. "Yeah, there's a fellow what's called Bob what owns the ag shop what's down the south side of town." Maybe this was a chance coincidence. Bob was a common name, but it wasn't a long walk, and my curiosity was getting the better of me. I hopped off the stool, downed the remainder of my drink, slung my pack over my back, and with the scroll in hand, walked out the bar. On the street outside, the general throng of people paced from shop to shop and street to street, fishers taking their haul to market and children playing chase around the trees and over the nearby bridge. I walked through the small village of Lumbridge and made my way south, past the large portcullis and down past the church. The south side of town was tighter packed than the rest, shops all crammed into a small corner, wooden buildings clearly being built by different people, as each had a different roof and different timber shapes. Beyond the southern market cluster I was in, I could see a graveyard, and just make out the smell of stagnant swamp water wafting over on the breeze. This was clearly the poorer end of town. I took in all the hanging signs outside the rows of shops, and finally saw a pair of crossed axes hanging from a rusty chain, and a wooden plank underneath with Bob's Axes, painted in red paint. With the scroll rolled up in my hand, I walked inside. The building was deceptively spacious. A heavy wooden table at one end with a till and several small sharpening stones piled up, ready to be sold. And round the outside, shelves stacked with various smithing tools, hammers, spades and axes of all shapes and sizes. A few barrels were stacked sideways on top of one another, holes in the top plugged with corks and smelling faintly of tree sap. Then, in the far corner, standing by a heavy, well-built grindstone, a tall man wearing a red shirt. "Can I help you?" he shouted over. I took a moment and thought about how to reply. I felt an old man I just met wants me to dig up your garden wouldn't get the response I was looking for, so I kept it simple. "Are you Bob?" The man had started to spin the grindstone and was sharpening the blade of an axe head. As he did, green sparks flew from it and showered his face. "I am!" he shouted over the high-pitched grinding. He hadn't looked up at me and was focused intensely on the task at hand. So with that, I turned around and faced the door of the shop. Then, with a single large stride, I stepped outside. The scroll had been very clear. 1 east, 7 north, 5 west, 1 south. I hadn't been here for long, but I remember from the map the cook had given me, the swamps were south of Lumbridge, so I faced away from the smell of swamp and took 7 large paces north. As I took my slow, deliberate paces, I could see through the doors of the church on my right-hand side. Father Eric was hosting a busy ceremony and preaching about something or other. I couldn't quite make out the distant words over the hum of the market. After 7 paces, I read the clue again. 5 west. I stood on the spot, turned 90 degrees to the left, my feet twisting into the soft mud underneath me, then took 5 large strides. It's lucky the church was busy, otherwise there'd be even more people around to watch my odd behaviour. Was this a prank? I couldn't shake the thought that the old man had written this earlier today and just gave it to the first person he saw drinking alone. I finished the 5 steps and took 1 final step south. I was standing against the outer wall of a small brick house, opposite the portcullis of Lumbridge Castle. Around me people were still going about the to and fro of small village life, and no one seemed to pay much attention to a single person standing by a small building. I could see the man in a blue robe with a flourished staff, the one who helped me earlier, offering advice to more new people as they came through the castle courtyard. And the rich-looking individual in the brilliant blue and silver armour hadn't moved from his spot on the riverbank, admiring the ducks. No one was watching me. So with what stealth I could muster, I casually kneeled down and started pouring at the soft mud with my hand, making sure to keep looking at the people around me, making sure I wasn't being watched. After scooping 2 or 3 handfuls of dirt out from under my feet and dropping them to the side, I'd started to dig a small hole and felt like an idiot. This was a joke. I was sure of it now. I was about to stop the digging and go back to the pub when I felt my fingertips brush across something other than mud. Fabric. I looked down into the hole and sure enough, I dug down and found the edge of another scroll, just like the first. Muddy and damp from the soil, but definitely fabric. I scooped another handful of mud away, then grasped the fabric and pulled. It looked exactly the same size as the first. I went to grab the first from my pocket and compare, but my pocket was empty. Maybe I misplaced the scroll, so I checked my pack, my belt. Nothing. The first scroll had vanished, and I was left looking at the second. Vios wasn't lying. This was the real deal. Hiding the scroll in my hand, I kicked the pile of mud back into the hole, stamped it down, and quickly paced away from the building toward the courtyard. Once I was out of sight of the crowd, I unfolded the second scroll. It was a map, a bird's-eye view map of somewhere. Several pictograms of trees, 2 circles that looked like maybe towers, and a large wall drawn around a smaller inner keep. I didn't know the world well, so I didn't know this place. Kneeling down, I took off my pack and took out the large map the cook had given me, the one he'd marked the farm on from earlier. I placed the small scroll on top of it, trying to see if any of the markings matched up. They did. It was here. The map on the scroll was Lumbridge Castle. The keep matched, the portcullis was in the right place. Even the trees on the small scroll perfectly matched where the trees were planted in the courtyard. And then I noticed a small sharp X painted in very fine ink on the small scroll, just between the back of Lumbridge Keep and the outer wall. A real treasure map. Vios hadn't been lying, and now I had the adventure I wanted. An X did indeed mark the spot. I rolled my larger map back into my pack and tucked the small scroll into my pocket, brushed the dirt from my knees, hands and legs, and walked round the tower and through the portcullis into Lumbridge Castle courtyard. The keep itself was the smaller building in the centre, and then around the outside ran a large grey stone guard wall, thick and tall, with flags flying high above, the light blue of the Lumbridge crest blending with the afternoon sky, and then the brilliant white chevron lashing as the flags fluttered. Hans was busy tending to the garden. He was digging up and moving some of the larger green shrubs that lined the stairs to the keep double doors. Digging away and whistling to himself, he ignored me as I crept around the back of the keep. The path between the back wall and the outer wall was quieter, and clearly didn't get as much attention as the front. The grass was longer and the weeds poked out. No visitors came here. It was a service entrance, used by staff and the occasional guard. The outer wall had a small gate leading to a tiny guard room, then the forest beyond. It was empty for the time being. I didn't know if I was allowed back here, or how a guard would react if they found a strange man digging a hole next to the keep foundations, but it would look very suspicious, so I had to act quickly. The ground here was much tougher than earlier, the mud thick with pebbles and dead grass, and digging with my hands would take far too long. I dropped my pack on the grass and made my way back round to the front. Peeking round the corner, I could see Hans working away. He was digging the shrubs up with a spade. Perfect. I only had to wait for a minute or two, as Hans wiped the sweat from his brow and went to take a big swig of water from a canteen on his hip. He held it high above his mouth and tilted his head back, but only a drop or two fell out. Empty. And with a look of annoyance, he made his way up the steps and, I assume, to the kitchen to refill it. I darted out from the corner, quickly took the spade and rushed back to my pack and began digging, driving the spade into the rough earth and quickly making a small mound of mud and pebbles to the side. It only took a few strong thrusts of the spade until I felt it hit something solid. I quickly dug around the object, then dashed back round the corner and placed the spade back where Hans left it. which was lucky, because the moment I was back round the corner again, I saw him hop back down the steps, pick it up, and continue working on the bushes. Looking back at the hole I'd dug, it was a substantial depth, and at the bottom in the centre, I saw the reflective shine of something glass. I reached down and wrapped my fingers around a strange glass orb, some clumps of mud and dried glass still clinging to its smooth surface. It was no bigger than my hand, crystal clear on the outside, fading through a brilliant sea blue, and in the centre a faint red glow seemed to pulse. It was unnaturally cold to the touch, and as I rolled it round in my hand, I could see it had no chips or imperfections anywhere, not even from when I hit it digging with the spade. Was this what Vios was after? A glass orb with something inside? He told me to meet him on the Port Sarim docks once I'd found it, and I didn't know where that was. I kicked the pile of mud and stones back into the hole and stamped it down with a few firm stamps. Honestly, it didn't look any different from before. I slipped the orb into my pocket and threw my pack over my shoulder. I'd gained quite the layer of mud with all this walking and digging, so I took a moment to scrape off the larger chunks from my boots, and then made my way back round the corner to the front of the courtyard. Hans would know. Hans lived and worked here, he'd likely know the local area, and Vios was an elderly man. It's unlikely Port Sarim would be too far. As I walked toward Hans, I reached my hand into my pocket. The orb was still an interesting curiosity to me, and I wanted to check if it was safe. I felt like a child with a new toy, and I had to protect it, when I felt something odd. It was much colder than before. Straight out the ground it was cold. The same cold you'd feel waking up on a winter's morning and placing your hand on a stone wall, but now it was ice. I pulled my hand away before my fingers froze to it. I stopped walking. Hans looked over, dug his spade into the ground, and leaned on the handle with both arms, and shouted, "You okay, Strife?" I stood perfectly still, and then thought, out loud, "My ball's cold." Hans slowly picked up the spade as he stared at me, his face a mix of confusion and gentle disgust, and then returned to gardening. I took a few slow, steady paces backwards, back to where I'd come from, and touched the glass orb again. Still cold, but definitely slightly warmer than last time. A few more paces. Another touch. Warmer still. I tightened the straps on my pack and held the orb in my hands and took a single, long stride toward the metal gate of the outer wall, the one close to where I'd found the orb. The orb again grew warmer. Still cold to the touch, but no longer icy. I kept walking, holding the orb in my hand tightly, and opened the gate, dashed through the small empty guard room, and then out to the western forest. I hadn't been this way before. I didn't have this drawn on my map. And looking up, I could see only dense forest, and then far to the west, the tip of a stone tower. I kept pacing, slow and steady each step, swapping the orb from hand to hand so I could feel any changes. The forest was vast, roots of tall trees writhing into the ground, then sprouting out again and coiling before returning to the earth. As I walked, I heard the scaly, slapping footsteps of a goblin, and glanced to my side to see two of them, walking casually along. They saw me and ignored me. I kept moving forward through the forest, Lumbridge Castle disappearing behind me, as I made my way further and further along. The trees sparse enough that sunlight was filtering down and brushing the layer of still green leaves. The orb was getting hotter as I walked. As I journeyed deeper into the forest, I decided to try and get my bearings and hopped up a small, grassy mound. The trees were still too thick to see through, but I could just make out some landmarks in the gaps in the leaves. The windmill I'd lost my pack at before was north of me, and to the south I could see the further I looked, the deader and deader the trees got. That must be the swamp. I knew Lumbridge was east of me, so the orb was leading me due west. Slightly more oriented, I pressed on, hopping down from the grassy mound and walking through the leafy foliage. Eventually I emerged from the thickest part of the forest and could see a village in the distance, a small, quaint-looking hamlet. Closer to me, however, was a shabby, grey-looking building made of old brick, moss growing into the stonework, and a lopsided roof, ringed by a wooden fence. The orb was hot to the touch, almost painful, and had not changed in some time. Investigating the building, I walked north and around, keeping my distance, and as I did, the orb grew even hotter, almost painful to the touch now. I was heading the right way, But then, as I stepped, I heard a sudden rustle of leaves behind me, the heavy pounding footsteps of a man running, and before I could fully turn and look, I was knocked to the ground by someone charging into me. The orb rolled from my hand into a tangle of tree roots and leaves. I scrambled to get back to my feet, and I was knocked down again, and a gruff, male voice belted out, "I'm not going back!" Before I could react, strong, powerful hands grabbed me by the throat, spun me round, and were holding me tightly. My back was pressed against a torso. Then I felt a dry, skinned hand covering my mouth and the cold edge of a blade pressed up against my throat. I'd been spun to face the grey building, and standing there, 2 armoured guards with maces held outwards, ready to fight. Again, the voice boomed. "I'm not going back. One more step and I will kill him. I swear to God I will cut his throat." My eyes were darting around, trying to make sense of this, as more guards appeared from round the side of the building. It was a prison, and clearly not a very good one, because whoever had managed to escape was using me as a human shield. As a guard took a step forward, the man pulled me in even tighter and pressed the blade harder against my neck. I could feel my skin tear slightly, and a warm trickle of blood run down to my chest. The guards advanced, slowly, as a unit, each slow step in time with the others, and the man's hand still pressed firmly over my mouth, pulling my head hard against his upper chest. While my arms were free, I didn't want a chance making a move. I knew my sword was hanging by my side, and I knew if I tried to draw it, I'd be dead. He kept slowly shuffling backwards, his bare feet gathering clumps of damp leaves as they slid along the forest floor. Bare feet. Keeping my head still, I moved my eyes, straining to see my side. The orb was lying on the ground close by, partially covered in leaves, but I could make out the glow of heat and see the ground around it was drying out. It was very hot. Carefully, slowly, and while keeping my hands down by my sides, I began pointing with my finger to the left. I needed the guards to notice. I needed the guards to move in formation around him. I needed them to herd my captor back toward the tree, and I needed them to notice soon. One of them seemed to, as he nudged the guard to his side and very softly nodded toward me. Then, as a unit, they all took a step to their side, advancing and twisting as one. The man holding me took more steps backwards, turning away from the guards as he did, the blade still digging in. More blood. My neck was now warm and wet. As the guards advanced, the man kept moving back, toward the tree, and with every step, towards the hot glass orb lying in wait on the floor. A few more steps, and we were almost there. The man lifted his foot and went to step back, his bare foot landing directly on the hot orb, and as it did, he flinched and let out a short cry of pain. Seizing the chance, I flung my head back hard, smashing the back of my skull into his chin as I brought my hands up to grab his forearm, pulling the blade away from my neck, and then sprinting forwards toward the guards. The man reeled backward, and the moment I was free of his grasp, the guards charged forward and past me. The first brought his mace down with force onto the side of the man's knee, and I heard a bone-crunching shatter. Then the others fell on top of him and pinned him to the ground. The man was trying to scream in pain, but his mouth was being pressed into the dirt by a guard's black-gloved hand. Together, they lifted him from the floor, each guard taking an arm or a leg, and as he thrashed and screamed, carried him back toward the grey prison. I touched my neck. The cut wasn't as deep as I'd imagined, and the trickle of blood had already dried. I'd clean it off later. I rummaged around on the floor and found the orb, still hot. I wandered round in a small circle, slowly increasing in size until I worked out where the orb wanted me to go, just north of where we were. It was leading me toward a giant wheat field, and as I approached the wooden fence that surrounded it, the orb suddenly erupted into a dazzling display of white light, and grew so hot I had to drop it. When it hit the floor, the light faded, but even standing above it, I could feel the heat remained. Maybe this was the next place to dig. I rolled the orb away with my foot, kneeled down, and started digging with my hands. The grass was short but tough. I had to dig my fingers in and pull out sods of earth to start. Then I could scoop the soil out with my hand. After only a few handfuls of dirt, I saw it. Another scroll. old parchment stained brown with dirt and time just like the first. Grasping the corner I could see, I pulled the scroll from the earth. Sitting down on the grass next to the small hole I'd dug, I unrolled the scroll with my muddy hands and read. It was a list of letters. ESBZOPS, QJH, QFO. That meant nothing to me. They weren't words. I couldn't imagine them being names of places or people. I stared at the scroll and racked my brain to make sense of it. A single line of letters, divided into 3 clumps of letters with no connection. I was lost. This meant nothing to me. I sat back on the grass and sighed. My neck had started to throb. I think the blade bruised it more than I realised. I'd probably hurt for a few days, and then be fine. My fingernails had black dirt stuffed into them, and my hands and arms needed a wash. I realised I hadn't wiped my lips since the prisoner had his hand on them, so spat onto the grass and wiped my mouth on my sleeve. Standing up, I rolled the scroll and shoved it into my pocket. I suppose I could meet Vios at the docks and tell him I'd gone as far as I could. I just needed to find out where Port Sarim was. The close-by village seems the best place. I'd just ask someone local. With that, I made my way away from the forest and toward the houses. As I got closer, I saw a crude wooden signpost, a pole with planks nailed to it, pointing in roughly the direction they should be. The one pointing toward the village read, Draenor. Draenor was a small fishing hamlet, it seemed, about the size of Lumbridge, built by the water's edge. I could see fishermen setting up large arrays of rods, and a woodcutter hacking away at a large yew tree down by the water. The village itself was a marketplace, with residential houses tucked away at the north, and the outdoor market square filled with tables and stalls. It was getting late, and traders were packing away shop, some shouting about deals on cheap fruit, others pouring piles of seeds back into jars to be stored and sold another day. I made my way toward the marketplace and approached the first stall I saw, a curious-looking shop. The man running it seemed simple enough, a plain brown tunic and brown hat with a feather tucked in the side, but the stall itself was a wild assortment of oddities. Wooden toy horses, a red flag hanging down the side. A wooden crossbeam held several multicoloured scarves, and inside a glass display case was a purple stone disc with odd markings etched into the surface and the centre cut out. "Can I help you, friend?" the man asked cheerfully. "I hope so. I'm looking for Port Sarim." The man was beginning to pack his stall away into a box underneath, placing the objects carefully inside. He replied, "Well, you're almost there. It's just over that wall. Big place with ships. You can't miss it." He was pointing west, beyond the edge of the market. I could see a dry stone wall, and then, in the distance, the mast of a ship rising into the air. "Ah, brilliant, thanks." Before I left, I couldn't help but gaze at the eclectic selection of odds and ends, and wonder how he managed to find all this stuff, let alone sell it. "It's a very odd selection of stuff you've got," I wondered out loud. The man stopped and looked at me. "Well, it can be an odd world." He picked up a pair of red wooden claws and slid them into the box. "The name's Diango, and I specialise in the weird and the wonderful, the puzzling and the perplexing." He wrapped the colourful scarves into a bundle and packed them away. Puzzling and perplexing, I thought. Well, it couldn't hurt to ask. I took the scroll from my pocket and handed it over to him. "Well, Diango, I'm Strife, and if you can tell me what this means, I'll buy something from you." With the prospect of a sale, Diango stopped and looked up. He took the scroll from me and furrowed his brow as he read the cryptic code. Taking a sheet of parchment, a quill, and a pot of ink from the table edge, he started writing down letters, glancing back and forth from the scroll to his makeshift cipher. After a few moments, he looked up, seemingly annoyed. "Are you calling me a pig?" I didn't know what he was talking about. "What? No, I just wanted some help working out what this is. If there's anything, it might not be anything at all." With that, Diango seemed to relax, his shoulders falling slightly, and he beckoned me over. He pointed to the parchment that he'd been writing on. "Someone's playing a trick on you, right? What you've got here is a cipher, specifically a shift. Means each letter is another." I nodded. "In this case, it's a simple one. Each letter has been moved forward, so all you got to do is shift them back, and then..." He held up the parchment he'd been writing on. It read, Draenor Pigpen. I can see now why he assumed I was calling him a pig. I smiled and placed the scroll back into my pocket, then looked over his almost bare table. Okay, deal's a deal. I'll take a horse. With that, I handed a coin to Diango, and he passed me a small, white, wooden toy horse, thanked me, and then returned to packing away his shop. The market square was slowly dying down, and a few stalls had been packed away and trundled off, some simply covered in a heavy blanket. And as I glanced over, I finally spotted a small, fenced-off pig pen just over the other side of the market. And with apprehension, I walked over. The smell. The smell was concentrated, and inside several pigs rolled around in the sloppy mud, clearly having a great time. Of all the places in all the worlds that I did not want to dig, this place would rate very highly on that list. But I'd come this far, and honestly, with my clothes in the state they are, I doubt I'd look much different, even after digging here. I opened the gate, walked inside, and closed it behind me. The pigs paid me no attention, and I walked through the mud. Each step was effort, as I had to pull my feet out of the thick, clumping ground and avoid stepping in what was obviously not mud. Once a few paces into the pen, I started to dig. The ground here was easy to scoop with my hands and fling around, and being careful to make sure it was only mud I was digging through, I kept digging, until eventually my fingers scraped along something hard and metal. I scooped away the mud to the sides, and running my fingers over the small metal box, found a handle, and pulled it from the mud with a satisfying squelch. A metal lockbox with a curved lid, thin metal banding down the edges, rivets holding it shut, and a strong-looking lock. The keyhole on the front was filled with dried mud. I'm not a locksmith, and even if I could afford one, places seemed to be closing, so Vios would have to make do with this. I'd followed the steps, and I'd found a locked chest. As far as I cared, this was absolutely treasure. I gently shook the box. No noise came from the inside, but it was heavy, meaning it was likely packed to the brim with something. I made my way out of the pig field, each step as careful as it needed to be, and through the gate. Once out, I scraped my boots on the bottom rung of the fence, leaving large clumps of mud clinging to the wood. I opened my pack and stored the chest safely inside, then slung it back over my shoulder and set off toward Port Sarim. The dry stone wall just west of the marketplace blocked me from walking directly there, so I followed the wall north until I found the main path and a gap through the wall. It was nice to walk on a stone road again. I could see the sails of the docked ships in the distance and hear the sounds of loading and unloading. As I walked closer to Port Sarim, the wonderful smell of sea air filled the road, salt and brine. Port Sarim was a medium-sized port. I made my way down the path and past the pub. It had a small crowd of people talking outside and drinking. Some sailors, some less savoury, likely pirates. One of them wore a tailored red overcoat and was talking somewhat louder than the rest. I walked on past them and onto the wooden planks of the docks. I could see Vios, standing just by the boarding plank of a large ship. I walked over and reached into my pack. As I walked up to him, I presented the locked chest. I have to admit, Vios, I thought you were lying about the whole thing. Vios smiled, his face somewhere between relief and malice. I am impressed. Guess I owe you a favour. He took the chest from my hands and placed it down by his side. I couldn't help but take another look at it. Just out of curiosity, Vios, what's in there? Vios glanced around nervously. Nothing important, just something that might be of use in Great Corend. He wanted to keep his secrets. I had no reason to push further. But I had to ask, what's Great Corend? Vios told me about the place he'd travelled from. A huge continent to the west, filled with 5 major cities. A place of intrigue and adventure. And finally, he asked me, as payment for that favour, if you like, I could take you there. I thought for a moment. I had to clean the blood from my neck and ideally have a bath. I felt one adventure was quite enough for today, and so simply replied, not today, thanks, but definitely another time. Thank you for listening to episode 2 of Trouble and Strife, a RuneScape audio drama. I hope you're enjoying the adventure. The ambient music in this episode was composed by Michael Ghelfi. Links to his channel are below. If you'd like to hear more audio drama adventures, then simply leave a comment. Or if you'd like to, consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for your time, and have a great day.